Hello, everyone. Good morning. I know you're all supposed to be in church, but we're going to just pretend. I'm very nervous being raised as a Catholic to address an audience at 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning, but we will let that go. We will let that go. Thank you all for coming here today. This is a very special exhibition, and I just want to thank the many sponsors. Our lead sponsor is actually here today. Denise Littlefield Sobel. Denise, raise your hand and thank you. And we also want to thank Andreas Halverson and Diane Halverson, who couldn't be here today. Howard Bellin. Howard, are you here today? There you are. Thank you. Aquavella, Bill Aquavella's in Europe, but he's also a great sponsor, as is the National Endowment for the Arts, the Netherlands America Foundation, and most importantly, the Consulate General of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and our Consul General is here today, and I'm going to ask him to speak. Rob de Vos. Rob?
Thank you very much, Michael, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Congratulations, Michael. Congratulations, Clark Art Institute. Congratulations to our curators for a fantastic exhibition, which was opened last night. And I'm proud to be here. I'm Rob de Vos, Consul General of the Netherlands in New York, but I'm responsible for the Dutch interests in this region, from New York, Philadelphia, New York, up to Boston and Maine. But I can tell you, this is the blockbuster summer exhibition. And people are jealous in Boston. And people are jealous in New York. Now, who of you still believe that Van Gogh, we call him Van Gogh, was a Frenchman? Because in the 2 minutes I will speak, as a diplomat, I will try to explain that Vincent van Gogh was a Dutchman. He was a Dutchman because he wanted to be a pastor, a preacher. And the saying is that Dutch people are salesmen and preachers. We like to sell things in the world, but also we like the world to know what our opinion is. Vincent van Gogh was a very hard worker. At the end of his life, and the specialists will tell you, he painted 3 paintings a day. We are hard workers. We close our office earlier than you. We close our shops earlier than you. We take holidays longer than you. But when we work, we really do work. So that's another aspect of Van Gogh. I'm still amazed Van Gogh often dropped out of school, but he spoke 3 European languages apart from Dutch fluently. He mastered it. He could read in it, could speak it. And when you go to the Netherlands, it's difficult to learn Dutch because most people will address you in English and sometimes, when you want to, in French or in German. And Vincent van Gogh liked to travel all around the world. And that's what we did 400 years ago. We came here, the Dutch, and we started New Amsterdam, and we started New Netherlands. And we stayed only 40 years, but we left a mark. And Van Gogh left a mark. He liked to travel, but he also longed to be home in the Netherlands. And I want you to come to the Netherlands and see for yourself why he did that. Michael, thank you very much, and enjoy the day.
Good. Well, thank you. New encouragement to get to Amsterdam and see the new Rijksmuseum, among the many other things. Thank you. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our panel today. Richard Kendall, who is the lead curator, our curator in charge here at the Clark, who's did that great exhibition on Degas Picasso that you all remember, I'm sure. He also did a show that many people in the profession remember, Degas Beyond Impressionism, at the National Gallery in London in 1996-1997, and also was at the Art Institute of Chicago. It was named the Museum Exhibition of the Year by Apollo Magazine in that particular year. Richard, thank you, and thank you for organizing this show. And he's going to lead our panel. And the panel includes our guest curators. Chris Stolwijk was the former curator of collections at the Van Gogh Museum. He was appointed head of the RKD, the Netherlandish Research Institute in Art History, which oversees a kind of an archive as well as a art historical information center based on Dutch art and in Amsterdam. They publish works. They're sort of action central. If you're an art historian or interested in art and want to know anything about Dutch artists, the Arcade is the place to go. He was at the Van Gogh Museum from 1996 to 2012 and is a great expert on Van Gogh, as is Char van Huytgen. Char is the former, also a collections curator, head of collections at the Van Gogh Museum. He's been an independent art historian since 2012, and like Chris, they're frequently asked to do exhibitions on Van Gogh outside of Amsterdam. I know in Char you're working on an exhibition in Arles that will be in 2014. The Arles one is 2016, right?
Yeah, 2014, 15, and 16.
A series, 2014, 15, and 16, and there's one in Mons in Belgium on now, right? Or soon. It's finished already in 2015, and working on one in Tokyo and Nagoya in 2016 and 17. So it's this rather brilliant team that has created this show, not only with their ideas, but also their political influence. And I'll let them talk a little bit about that. Richard, do you want to begin?
Is this working? Yes. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're very touched to see this sea of eager faces and happy faces, I'm glad to say. This is, for us, is the end of a very long process. A lot of you will have seen the exhibition. If you haven't already seen it, you'll see it afterwards, after this session. It comes with a very, very handsome catalogue, which has been produced by the Clark, which encapsulates this exhibition and some of our thinking about the show. And I'm waving it because the title, which can seem sort of almost too simple and almost too neat, is one we took very seriously. When we first got together around 4 years ago and began to formulate the idea for an exhibition for the Clark, we agreed on several things. It had to be a serious exhibition. It had to be something that was appropriate to the Clark, which, as you all know, is famous for its research programs and for its scholarship. The idea of nature being central to Van Gogh's art was something that we all agreed about. And I'm sure many of you know that he was a great letter writer. These days you can see all of his letters online for free. And when we started to go further with this project, I analyzed some of these letters and found that he uses the word nature in every third letter on average. Now, I don't know how many of you write letters and emails, but do you use the word nature every third message? Probably not. And that's when a little bell went off in my head, and I thought, I need to look into this. And I talked to Chris and Schra. They immediately said, yes, this was a fundamental issue. And then we got to the question of, what did that mean? Nature's a kind of woolly concept. And so that's when we got serious. And Chris, who's an expert on Van Gogh's early years, offered some thoughts on the relevance of nature at that point. And Schra, who has mainly concentrated on the later years, likewise. And from there on, the theme developed rapidly and I think very richly. You'll see his paintings and drawings of nature. Most of you have probably already seen them downstairs, and you can see that nature is present in every one of those pictures. But there is another level to this, and that is, we said, well, here he is in the 1880s in Europe. What did that word mean in Europe in the 1880s? What did nature mean? And some of you will be well aware of the answer to this. Nature appears in the writings of some of the great novelists of the time. In America, I shall continue. The poetry of Walt Whitman is full of nature. The writings of Charles Darwin are full of nature. And getting closer, even closer to Van Gogh, who was a great reader, we know the titles of at least 500 of the books that he read. The word appears again and again, and he mentions his reading in his letters. He read, his favorite authors were George Eliot, the English novelist, who lived in the English countryside, but of course knew about encroaching modernity. And she writes novels that are based on the city village, the city countryside dynamic. Émile Zola was another of his passionate loves in literature. And Zola, very prolific and very controversial novelist, himself was born in the country and ended up living in Paris. And he wrote, again, several novels which have this dynamic, city versus country. And in his later novels, he talks about Paris being a smelly, disgusting place in contrast to the beauty and freshness of nature. So this debate is already there. We would call it today ecology or environmentalism or something like that. But that way of thinking about nature as something fragile, but also fundamental to our world and our identity as human beings is there. And that is the fundamental thread that runs through our writing and our exhibition. Now, what we're going to do is each of us are going to talk for 10 minutes or so about our section of the exhibition and pick up this thread, show you a couple of images. So Chris will develop this idea in the context of Holland. I will return with talking about it in a city, nature in the city, in Paris, in this case, in Van Gogh's case. And then Schra will take it from there in the later period. So that is the basis of our thinking, and you'll see in the catalogue, you'll see in the exhibition, you'll see in what we say how we have tried to develop this and help to understand it in Van Gogh's art. So, Chris.
Yeah. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chris Novak, director of the RKD, and I'm most pleased and honored to be here today to give you some insights in this show, Van Gogh and Nature, on which we collaborated over the last 4 years. My own interest in Van Gogh and nature already started working at the Van Gogh Museum in the late 90s, and finally had a first thought in an essay in 2003 in a catalogue called The Choice of Vincent, or Vincent's Choice, in which Van Gogh and nature played a minor part. Yes, I do not really know, let us say, the level of knowledge on Van Gogh and on his life, and so I will start with a few biographical facts before pointing out at his early days as an artist in the early 80s of the 19th century. Van Gogh was born in a small place called Zundert in the south of the Netherlands, near the Belgian border, and that is a very particular place because it's a Roman Catholic area for at first. That means that born as and raised in a family of a minister of a Protestant minister in a Roman Catholic environment also means something for social life. So there was a very small community of Protestants which his father and his grandfather preached for. Van Gogh was born in a landscape that differs, I think, from the view most of you have of the Netherlands. That's a flat landscape with dikes and a man-made landscape, small canals, windmills. Well, that's not the case in Zundert and in the surroundings of Zundert. You will find woodlands there. You will find wetlands, I think that's, and even what is called swamps. There are the two first drawings you will see in the exhibitions is they are made near well, in the surroundings of Zundert, but near Etten, and those are depictions of swamp and wetland. That's the landscape in which Van Gogh grew up as a child. And he could be found in the garden of the parsonage almost every day, in the words of his sister Lies, who wrote her memoirs in the early 1910s about Van Gogh. And there she stated that Van Gogh could be found every day in nature and looking for little bugs, for flowers. And he had his own collection, even with I think already at that time with all the species names and Latin names with it. So he was really interested in the natural surroundings, in ecology, as Richard said earlier on. But at an early age of 15, 16, he was sent to have a profession. And the family, the Van Gogh family, consists more or less of, the family members had three possibilities in professional life. First, become a pastor or a minister, just like the father of Van Gogh and his grandfather. To become a military in the Marines. He had a very high officer, an uncle who was a very high officer in the Dutch Marine, or be an art dealer, because three of his uncles were the most important art dealers in the Netherlands in the second half of the 19th century. And one of those three was his uncle Vincent, called Uncle Cent, who was partner of the largest art dealer in Europe at that time, Goupils, which had his main branch in Paris, but also a branch in The Hague. And Van Gogh went to The Hague to become an art dealer. He was in the art trade for 6 to 7 years, but was fired at an age of 23, which, of course, becoming the black sheep of the Van Gogh family at that time. And already at that time, he not only had an enormous interest in contemporary art, being an art dealer. He saw, well, prints and drawings and paintings every day, and he must have seen thousands and thousands of works of art during those 7 years at Goupils, but also developed his, let us say, his religious, well, fundamentalism, more or less, because he wanted to step into the footsteps of his father and to become a minister himself. But he didn't have the right education. He went to Amsterdam to study theology, failed again, and had several other, let us say, experiences for becoming a preacher in the Borinage, in the south of Belgium, before finally around 80, his brother Theo and in combination with his father, advised him to become a draughtsman, not an artist as such, but to become a draughtsman for magazines, art magazines that were spread around Europe at that time on an enormous scale. So the first years, he really he was supported by his brother with let's say, a small endowment every month. Also, his father supported him, and in the first years he started to draw, mainly as an autodidact. He did it all himself by reading books that could help him to become a draughtsman. And at that time, he moved in with his parents in the south of the Netherlands, in a place called Etten, which is not far away from Zundert, I think only 10 to 15 miles. And there he started to draw together with a fellow artist he knew from his period as an art dealer in Paris, called Anton van Rappert. And in those years, they collaborated already, going outside and making drawings in the surroundings of Etten. But as you will see also in the exhibition, and and also Richard and Schwab will probably point out, that Van Gogh always found his motives and nature nearby. So you see here on the screen, to start with, yes, it's on the left and the right. It's the parsonage garden in this case in Nuenen. A few years later, after some experiences as an artist in The Hague and Drenthe, but you will see that in the exhibition. But in Nuenen, which is also in the south of the Netherlands, he depicted the parsonage garden where he stayed with his family again. And you will see that it's a winter garden. One of the motives during his whole career and in his oeuvre is the depiction of the seasons and the cycle, also the cycle of life, on which probably Schwab will elaborate more. But here you see the depiction of winter as a winter garden, the garden of the parsonage in Nuenen, also with a figure in black. He writes in his letter, well, the figure in black symbolizes for me winter. And in this case, it's probably one of his sisters or his mother in the garden of the parsonage. And in the back, the horizon, you will see the old church tower, which also could remind us of the religious backgrounds of Van Gogh. Because in many works, also here in the exhibition, there are 3 works from this period, this specific period, you will see that he depicts the old church tower of Nuenen again and again. Because one of the, not because, but besides being an avid reader, he was brought up as a son of a minister, of a Protestant minister, and in which, in a certain, not a very strict Protestantism, but a liberal form of Protestantism, which is called the Groninger School, which is in the north of the Netherlands, but it's a very liberal way and a liberal branch of this religion, in which nature is God's handiwork, as Richard always said, but the creation of God, and that you will see that in his writings he will always turn back to nature as being really something that is created and that can be that you have to discover being a human being, because as a human being you are thrown into nature and you have to make your own relation with nature as such. Maybe I can have the next one. As I said, he went in the early 80s. He went to Etten, started to draw, then had some lessons by an uncle called Anton Mauve, which was a very famous painter in those days, of one of the frontmen of the Hague School painting. And he had some lessons in The Hague in 1882, 1883. He was in The Hague. Moved to the north for a couple of months, and then in 1884, 1885, he went back to his parents in the south of the Netherlands, in Nuenen, and he already in these years he also started to paint. He started that in The Hague, and in Nuenen he was when he was back in Nuenen, he not only made a lot of drawings of the workers in the field, which was a major theme in that time for him, and the weavers, but also made his first large-scale landscapes, also influenced not only by some color theories of early Romanticist painters, but also by his 17th century Dutch predecessors. And here you will see, I think, one of it's a very important painting also in the exhibition, because it marks the end of the Dutch period, and the transition to his Paris period, where he was in 86 up to 88, on which Richard will speak soon. Where color becomes a major theme in his work, and I think that this painting now in Rotterdam shows that exactly. Richard.
Well, that's a perfect lead-in to the next section. I'm going to talk briefly about Paris now, the Paris section, which is the second section in the exhibition with the red walls. And as Chris has eloquently summarized for you, Van Gogh came from this deep rural life with gathering some experience of living in cities. And by this date, he's clearly feeling restless. He knows that the art that he's seeing around him in Holland is provincial. He's hearing through his uncles, through his brother, Theo, and from other sources, that there is a new kind of art which is taking Europe by storm. And that art, of course, was Impressionism, which was largely French, and much of the exhibition history of Impressionism is based in Paris. And Van Gogh says in a letter, I've heard of this thing called Impressionism, but I don't know what it is. It was a very obscure and really revolutionary thing, and he was clearly quite nervous about it. But very soon after painting the picture on the left-hand screen, Van Gogh goes to Paris, and as you've seen in the exhibition, there is a dramatic, almost an overnight change in the way his pictures look, in his priorities as an artist, and in almost every aspect of what he was doing. This, in terms of its color, in terms of its confidence, in terms of its drama, is nothing like the work he was making in Holland. And we're told that he painted 200 flower pictures in Paris. I personally have doubts about that because nothing like that number survived. But when you think about it, the flower picture is a wonderful way of learning about color. Flowers are colorful, and it gave him a chance to experiment, as in this one, with some oppositions. So red, which is a warm color, blue, which is a cold color, immediately sets up a dynamic on the surface of the canvas. But note what he chose. Other artists might have chosen a street scene or a still life of vases and that kind of thing. Van Gogh chose flowers. Flowers are a recurring obsession throughout Van Gogh's career, from when he was learning to paint in Holland, very much so in Paris, and then you all know about what happens in Provence, where he becomes famous for his pictures of irises, of sunflowers, in glorious colors on a big scale. And flowers are one of our most familiar ways of contact with nature, even in cities, even in towns. We buy flowers, we have flowers in our houses. They are part of nature that comes in and lives with us, that we love to have around us. And even in a tower block, in a monstrous apartment above New York, you can love your flowers and grow flowers and bulbs. And that I think is one of Van Gogh's ways of holding on to his rural beginnings when he's painting in Paris. He paints, again and again, he paints flowers. He was very excited when he came to Paris, but he went to Paris, picking up on Chris again, specifically to learn. He wanted to be taught how to be a modern artist. So he went and studied with a rather conventional teacher to try and improve his drawing. At this school where he went, he met some young artists whose names are now famous. People like Toulouse-Lautrec, Georges Seurat, Émile Bernard, Anquetin, and so on. Artists who were either friends of the people at the school or that he met as a result of going to classes. And suddenly Van Gogh was in the avant-garde, moving in the avant-garde, but not, he says in one of his letters, he was not yet one of them. Unfortunately, he's in Paris with his brother, so we don't have any letters between them in the Paris years, which is a big hole in the correspondence. We have to be like detectives in Paris. But we know that Theo rented an apartment in Montmartre. Those of you who have been to Paris will know that Montmartre is a curious little sort of village within Paris, high on a hill overlooking the city, where still it's a neighborhood. It's a place with small cafes and crazy winding streets. At that time, it was also known for its gardens and allotments. It was known for its windmills, which originally actually worked as windmills, but were already by this time a sort of tourist attraction. And people used to go to Montmartre to enjoy the low life and the bars and have fun. That's where he lived, and that's where he began to try and make himself into a modern artist. It's a fascinating story. Slowly he begins to get what Impressionism about, different kind of handling with paint, a different kind of color palette, and different artists you turn to for your inspiration. And within a short time, he becomes quite fluent. He sees an exhibition of Claude Monet's paintings soon after he arrives, and is thrilled and amazed and doesn't really know what to do with them because they are so radical. He sees the work of these other artists that I've mentioned, and within a short space of time, he's borrowing ideas from them, he's absorbing ideas from them, but nature never leaves him, even in Paris. Okay, you've already done it, yeah. Chris is anticipating my thought. We're very close. And this extraordinary picture, one of the great loans, many great loans in this exhibition, this is from Yale, not often lent. A large canvas by Vincent's standards, where he is specifically using some of the techniques he's encountered amongst his friends. It has the dot technique, the pointillist mark, which Sower had pioneered and other artists had already picked up and done variations on. It has the bright light that we associate with Impressionism, with Monet, with Pissarro, with Cézanne. And he's really making a modern picture more or less for the first time in his life. But, and it's a big but, he doesn't choose to paint a railway station, which is what Monet did. He doesn't choose to paint some of the great structures of Paris and the boulevards of Paris in the way that, that his friends did. Van Gogh, with a wonderfully sort of perverse move, finds nature in Paris. And again, he paints trees, he paints parks, he paints flowers, and of course he does make some pictures of the city, but he can't let go of nature. And in that sense, we find our theme taking a new turn. It's still there, but it's now in a different environment. Paris was thrilling for him, but also very challenging. He lived on a very modest stipend from his brother. He painted incredibly ambitiously and often. His health wasn't good. He had terrible trouble with his teeth. People didn't understand him. When he tried to sell his pictures, people laughed at him or turned him away. And after about 2 years in Paris, which were utterly transformative for him, he said to Theo, I'm out of here. And he says, I'm going south, where he had heard that in Provence, this is a land of sunshine, a land of open spaces, a land where nature, as in Holland, still dominated their people's lives. And with very little notice, more or less a few hours notice, what happened then? It's telling me I've spoken too long, I think. Thank you. Hello. Yes, so he arrives in Arles, first of all, and this is where I hand over to Schra, but this now rather exhausted Dutchman arrives in the south of France, and this truly extraordinary next chapter of his life begins.
Piece of paper with the titles.
Van Gogh went to Arles he arrived in Arles on the 20th of February 1888, and actually he had wanted to go on to Marseille. His brother Theo wrote to one of his sisters that Van Gogh went to Arles to find his bearings because the big city had exhausted him, and then would go on to Marseille, which never happened. To his great surprise, Van Gogh, who had also left Paris because of the cold, arrived in Arles finding 60 centimeters of snow, which is something like 23 inches or so. So that was not entirely pleasant because he had hoped to set out to find the countryside and make landscape paintings, but he had to wait no less than 3 weeks before being able to do so. What is very important for the period in Arles is that Van Gogh got to know Japanese prints and other Japanese art forms while in Paris. And he had developed a great love for Japanese art. He had started to collect Japanese prints. In the Van Gogh Museum nowadays, his collection is kept and still runs well over 500 of those prints. And he admired them no end. And another important point is that he had started to read about Japanese artists and had found something in their lives, in the way they lived, also much imaginary, more in his head than was a real fact with these Japanese artists. He thought they worked together in groups, they worked in harmony, which is all not true, but it was in his mind, and he hoped that people would come to Arles to work with him. That would take a while, and the only one who would actually do so was Paul Gauguin. That happened only in October. And in the meantime, Van Gogh set out to discover the countryside, looking at it with a Japanese eye, as he called it himself. In this case, it is Japan, but there are many other examples for Van Gogh looking at landscapes through the eyes of other artists. He did so when he was in the Netherlands in a province called Drenthe, where he was reminded of the artists from the school of Barbizon and saw Jules Dupré, saw other artists, Breton, in that landscape. It's a fascinating way of him looking through the eyes of other artists, then looking through the eyes of the Japanese, and we, again, looking at these landscapes through the eyes of Van Gogh, of course. So he set out once the weather was better, and his fascination for the seasons fully bloomed like the orchards at that time, and he set out to make orchards in blossom. Van Gogh was a very systematic man. He has this reputation of being the painter who painted expressively, who did whatever came in his mind. Not true. If Van Gogh tells you in his letters to Theo, he wants to make orchards in blossom, maybe a dozen. There can be 11, there can be 13, but it will be what he said. He always manages to have a campaign, as it were, for making works on the same subject. Remarkably, he was in the South for the first time, but he sets out to do things, well, a young admirer. He sets out to do things that he had always wanted to do, really, when he was still in the North. Paint the seasons. He had not done that into major paintings, except for maybe the one that Chris has shown, Autumn, the poplars. But he was not enough of a painter at the time to do that fully fledged. So now he sets out the orchards. Then the harvest season starts. Wheat is ripening, and he paints the young wheat, then the ripening wheat, then the harvest of the wheat. So it's really concentrating on what he sees developing into these, in the plain of La Crau. That is a large plain near Arles, where he spent a lot of his time and found wonderful subjects. Then the harvest of the grapes. He makes two wonderful paintings. The harvest, the autumn scenes, which he finds, and Chris already said that, he needs very little. He needs very small motifs, almost nearby his home, and that's what he does with autumn. There's a little park just in front of his house, the Yellow House, and it's ideal for making wonderful autumn scenes. This little park, which he calls the Poets Park at some point. You will see one of the greatest works from the Phillips collection in the exhibition. It's very romantic, little figures. This is where people find consolation, a very important theme for Van Gogh. He wants to give people consolation. He finds himself consolation in literature and nature, and in his work he wants people to give people the same thing. That's what many of these works of nature are about. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I have too many things here. My own leg is my lectern. So. The Sower is one of those wonderful paintings that have to do with the harvest. And it's also about something completely different, because Van Gogh, when he went to Arles, he also had another ambition. He wanted to make a major modern figure piece. And he, as a great admirer of Jean-François Millet, who had made in 1850 a great painting, much admired by everybody, The Sower, a magnificent, monumental work, he wanted to have that as a subject and use modern color to make it into a truly modern subject. And he chose to put that figure on the wheat on the background. So the wheat is still being harvested while the young wheat is already coming again. And that's really the great cycles of nature that he is showing us here. That was something which Van Gogh was much inspired by, and it was as important for him as real nature, man-made nature. The harvest was one of the great things that he wanted to render in his art. I'm afraid that I'm looking at your notes. Well, the orchards I already spoke about, so I'll give you a brief look at that. It was a very important period for Van Gogh, and later in the year, as I already said, Gauguin came to him, and they started to paint together, and the subject changed a little bit. Nature became a little bit less important. They started to paint figures and so on. And you probably know all about the relationship between Gauguin and Van Gogh. The two liked each other, but not actually got along very well, clashing opinions about art, clashing characters. So it ended in the well-known drama in which Van Gogh cut off an earlobe. Gauguin left. Van Gogh's dream of people coming to the south collapsed, and so did Van Gogh, because the first signs of his illness became apparent. He had to go to the hospital. And in May 1889, he had himself, he went out of his own choice to the Asylum of Saint-Remy, called Saint-Paul-de-Massol. He was by then thoroughly tired, disappointed, and he wanted some rest. And the asylum was not a place full of dangerous people or anything like that. It was actually a place where he found peace, because there was also a wonderful garden. And Van Gogh, the first month or even 6 weeks of his stay there, he spent all his time in that garden. And it was a wonderful place for him, and really reminded him of a book that he had already read in his youth by Alphonse Karr, called Voyage autour de mon jardin, Journey Through My Garden, in which, in fictive letters, Karr writes about his garden to a friend, writing about insects, writing about flowers, writing about all the things that you find in a well-kept, beautiful garden. And the garden in the Asylum of Saint-Remy gave him all kinds of subjects. And one of them is this wonderful small painting, as you will see in the exhibition, of a moth which he discovered. And he wrote to Theo, to make a painting of this moth, I would have had to kill it. But it was such a beautiful animal, I couldn't do that. So he made a quick sketch which is also in the exhibition, and then made this wonderfully beautiful small painting, which is also very much inspired by Japanese art. You will see several prints in the exhibition by Japanese artists, and you will notice that it is even about the same size. So Van Gogh found many motifs in the garden for the time being, but then set out to discover the surroundings of the asylum. And more than he had done in Arles, where he had set out to find motifs that he already liked, the wheat harvest, the blossoming trees, he now set out to find truly Provençal motifs. I have to speak more in this thing, I think. And I show you this one. Of course, very Provençal, a cypress in the middle of a wheat field. And Van Gogh painted all these things, olive groves, the cypresses, and other truly Provençal motifs. And he really wanted to make a range of paintings with Provençal motifs at that time, something which had not occurred to him so much in Arles. But the harvest of the wheat also was something which he could again make into a major subject, because looking out of his cell and going out of the asylum briefly and standing in this place, he saw a wheat field where he could record the whole cycle of the wheat again. Young, fresh wheat, very green, very beautiful, also in the exhibition. Then all these stages until again the wheat was harvested. This painting shows you this tiny figure of a reaper harvesting the wheat, and Van Gogh compared him to a figure like death, but it's not a painful, not a gruesome death. It's a death with a smile, because after this death, everything starts again. So that's what these cycles of nature mean to Van Gogh. It's going on, and it's bigger than us. It's truly important, and human beings can hardly comprehend it, but it gives you consolation. It gives you a new hope, because there's no end, really. And there we have the olive trees that he also put so much effort in. He made a couple of, I think, about 15 of them. Very beautiful, very strong. And in this work, you see him, this is the first one he did, and you see him looking for those strange forms, those, he had never, in Arles there were hardly any olive trees, at least no groves, so this was the first time that he really could do that. And he starts investigating, how do I catch these forms? And next to this work you will see a drawing where he's even more searching for this very peculiar form of an olive tree. In May 1890, Van Gogh has had enough of the asylum. He feels it, he's getting more ill rather than better. So he decides that enough is enough, and he moves again to the north. He also got tired about the circumstances in the south. In the end, he became the great artist there, probably his most wonderful works, but Van Gogh felt that maybe he was more a man of the north than of the south. So after 27 months in Provence, he left and went to Auvers-sur-Oise, where Richard will pick up.
Is this working now? Okay. Take this one. What? Yes? Yes, okay, okay. So very briefly, he is in Auvers-sur-Oise, just northwest of Paris, a small town, for around 3 months. Typically, he arrives full of enthusiasm, and he writes to his brothers, nature is beautiful here, he says. Nature is beautiful. He starts to paint flowers, he starts to paint the fields, and the skies with a different palette, because this is no longer the warm south, this is the wet north. So green comes back into his palette right there. This is one of the earlier pictures he made in Auvers. Because I want to allow some time for questions, I'm going to summarize this section. He was tremendously productive. He seemed to paint or draw every day. The pictures just kept coming. He sent them back to he sent some to his brother in Paris, and he's full of energy, but he says, sometimes he says, I am tired. I don't know if I can keep going. At this time, he had admirers. People came to Theo's apartment in Paris to see his pictures. He still hadn't sold anything. And for a man in middle life, this was pretty harsh, pretty harsh. His health wasn't good. And he says his mood goes up and down, violent mood swings. And in circumstances that are not entirely clear, after about 3 months, he decides to take his own life. He gets hold of a gun and shoots himself. It's a terrible end. We have truly wonderful loans, including this picture that the National Gallery in Washington has only just acquired, which show a kind of breadth and a generosity of spirit as a painter, but the specific subjects that we've been identifying, the reaper and the olive tree and so on, are much less evident. And at the end of the exhibition, those who've seen it already, you are confronted by this. It's my personal favorite from the whole show. It's a mysterious, unprecedented work of art. It's difficult to find anything like it in the history of European art up to this date. It's called simply Rain, or Rain au Vert, and it was probably amongst the last pictures he painted. And so it's a sort of tribute to this extraordinary man who ended up painting nature, painting the elements, rain, painting the landscape, painting things growing, the cycle of nature, the cycle of the weather, as my colleagues have described. So it's a poignant ending to the exhibition. It's the right place to end our talk. And I'm now going to ask for questions. But I would ask you, please, to focus your questions on this exhibition, this side of Van Gogh. We don't want to get into theories of suicide and all this kind of thing and mental health. That's not what this show is about. So if you have specific questions about our theme, then we're going to have to, yes, we're going to have to get somebody to, thank you, Eleanor, to carry a microphone to those who wish to speak. Okay, so it's back on? Okay, yeah. We seem to be, yes. Okay.
Good morning.
Yes.
I'm just very grateful to have been here and being able to see the exhibition yesterday late afternoon. Beautiful, beautiful, remarkable exhibition. And while I was walking through, I had a very, I was looking at the Sower, where it had the comparison of the other painting drawing next to it. And I was looking, and I was wondering if you have anything further to describe, because it seems that after I was looking for a while, the sun, around the sun...
Which painting were you looking at?
The Sower?
The Sower, right.
I'm sorry, my accent. The Sower, yes. And it seems that around the sun, it was a lot of a very thick impasto,
yes.
right? Which it was very different to the right side of the painting and towards the left.
Yes.
And so I was looking, and then it seems also that behind the middle center, it seems that it had probably maybe another painting underneath, because it clearly saw some kind of drawings and lines behind. Yeah. And I'm just curious to know if, because it was a painting that he used to study, another one, there were anything to know more about it.
It's an interesting question, and I will hand this over to Shra. This is his territory.
I must say that I really admire how well you looked at this painting, because you are entirely right. This was Van Gogh's first attempt at the Sower, and it was an important theme for him, so he wanted to get it right. And he didn't at first. So he actually did put the Sower in another spot. He changed all kinds of things. He at first gave the Sower white trousers, because he thought he needed kind of a resting point for the eye. Then found out, of course, that is quite a silly garment for a peasant. So the trousers became blue, and he kept working on this work. And actually, you can tell he was not entirely satisfied in the end, because he couldn't get it right. He scraped away paint. He put new paint on top. So You're completely right. This is a work that was highly experimental, and a lot is going on, indeed, also under the surface.
Thank you. Another question, please. We have a question about, there's a microphone just coming.
Are there any direct references? You mentioned George Eliot, you mentioned Charles Darwin. Are there any direct references in Van Gogh's letters to some of the literary or scientific influences of the times?
Well, you will be pleased to know that when you buy your catalogue, you will find a short essay about Van Gogh and natural history, in other words, science. It's, what I did quite simply is bring together references throughout his letters, which shows that he was indeed a well-educated child who had clearly had contact with science at a basic level at school. We were told that he collected insects and birds and flowers and put them under classifications with a Latin name on. This is an early interaction with science at a modest level. But later on in his life, his letters are, you'll find scattered references to great figures from the sciences. He mentions the name of Isaac Newton, for example, which is not what you expect Van Gogh to do. And later on, he cites a living scientist, Camille Flammarion, who was a famous French astronomer who developed very sophisticated telescopes, who made a lot of discoveries, but he was also, this shows the difference of time in historical time, he was also into the kind of slightly crazy, are there people on the moon? Are we going to, is there other civilizations out there which we don't take so seriously anymore? But this was real science, and again he mentions these things. He had an engraving in his collection of engravings, which was a sort of, from a British magazine, which was a sort of joke about Darwinism. So clearly he knew the Darwin reference. There's no suggestion that he spent long hours of his life keeping up to date with contemporary science. But he's a very interesting case of something that we're all familiar with today, of just picking up bits and pieces when he opened his newspaper, when he was a great reader of magazines. So he acquired a sort of working knowledge of what was happening out there. And this theme needs to be taken further. I think it's more interesting than people have understood in the past. But thank you for your question. We have a lady on the front. Let's see.
I'm glad you mentioned the bits and pieces picked up, because one that I've picked up more recently is about the red paint that Van Gogh had used in a lot of his paintings that is now fading because of the chemical composition. Yet when I see one of the paintings that you have there, the vase with carnations, the red seems vibrant. Did he use a series of different shades of red or different types of paint over time? And my other question then, should we also... Oh, all right, stay with that one, all right.
He indeed used several types of red. Some of them stay the same over the years. The ones that fade are organic reds, lake reds as they called, and they faded quite quickly, already some years after he died, and it's the ultraviolet in the light that makes them fade. So many of those shades are no longer there. But the ones that you see that are very strong nowadays are simply different pigments.
Okay. And are there other colors as well that have faded over time because of what he had used in his paints? I in particular like a lot of the blues and kind of the purple blues in the skies, and something like a wheat field with cypresses. Is that still close to the original color that he painted, or has that also changed over time?
Many have changed over time, not only the red colors, but the good news is that Van Gogh sometimes was aware of colors fading slightly, because already in works by the Impressionists, people had seen that happening. So some colors he used stronger than he wanted them to look at the very moment, and keeping into mind that at a later moment they would be a little more subdued. So he was calculating that. Having said that, in the end, he couldn't calculate that because the damage occurs over many, many years, and many paintings that we now know looked very different at the time. So, to name one example, the bedroom that has such wonderfully pale blue walls had purple walls in reality. So people in the early 20th century really saw a different Van Gogh than we know nowadays. That sounds terrible, but that's the way it goes with art. It doesn't look... It's almost nature, exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lady here, yes. Kathy,
Elena's got it.
yes.
What were the years of his productivity and how many paintings have survived?
Gentlemen.
I can go on then. Van Gogh started out as an artist in August 1880, and he died on the 29th of July. Did I say 80? Yeah, 1880, and he died on the 29th of July 1890. So he was an artist for a mere 10 years, and the first 3 of that he did nothing much else but drawing. So he was a painter really for only 7 to 8 years. During that time, he made some 850 paintings and some 1,200 drawings. And to give you an idea about how productive he was, in those last 10 weeks of his life in Auvers-sur-Oise, 70 days, he made no less than 70 paintings and a good group of drawings as well. So he was an extremely productive artist.
More questions?
Did Van Gogh have a spiritual motivation or interpretation of his paintings of nature and the world around us?
Well, partly, I think. Yes, it is. Yeah. Partly, I think, especially in the let's say the early years of his career, and I was showing the Winter Garden. There is, I think, some symbolic reference to his religious upbringings and thoughts. He was from the mid-70s up to the late 70s. He was deep into reading the Bible and studying theology. I think around 100 of his letters from that period are more or less just he's copying parts of the Bible, and it's when he starts to become an artist and when he starts to draw, religion more or less fades out of his life. But still, I think, and now we're on what territory that we have discussed also largely over the last years, and we do not fully agree. At least Richard and I don't know what Schra's thoughts are on this matter. But I think there is still a kind of basso continuo in his life because of his childhood, being the son of a minister, but also that he had this ambition to become a minister himself. And you see that also in his letters he writes a lot about nature being God's creation, as I said before. And I don't think that has, well, it just turned 180 degrees around, that there was nothing left anymore. And you see it also that his belief in nature as being eternal and the circle of life every time, going, the growing and the ending of life. So yes, it's a large answer to say that I think that there's still a kind of a religious feeling in his life, actually.
We have 2 hands up over there. We should probably make these the last questions. Thank you for your questions. They've been very interesting. Please.
Yes, I wanted to know whether, you mentioned Walt Whitman earlier, but I wanted to know whether Van Gogh was at all familiar with the American Transcendentalists in general, or people with Emily Dickinson or Thoreau or Emerson, And what about the German transcendentalists? And I'm trying to think now of Rilke's dates, but whether he would have been familiar with the poetry of Rilke, especially the Book of Hours and so on.
As far as I know, there is no specific reference to that group, though curiously, he was familiar with some American literature. There was a time when he read Harper's Weekly. Not everybody knows that, which is curious. So he was aware of the culture in the United States up to a point. The extent to which he read deeply into that, I don't know. Anything to add? No. And the lady next, okay, yes.
Was there a relationship between Monet and Van Gogh, given that his love of nature was also so great?
Wouldn't it be wonderful if there was? It would truly have been wonderful. The answer is no, other than a relationship of admiration. I've said that when Van Gogh came to Paris, he saw the 1886 Impressionist exhibition in that year. But that was the year when Monet who was now experiencing a lot of success in his art, decided to move out of the group and exhibit separately. So he had an exhibition of his recent work at an art dealer's in Paris. Van Gogh doesn't specifically say he went to that exhibition, but it's 99.9% likely that he did. In the exhibition, you will see here, if you haven't already seen it, a painting by Claude Monet that was in that exhibition, which happens to belong to the Clark, so we put it up. This is a picture he would have seen. It's called Tulip Fields at Sassenheim. It's actually a painting of Holland, appropriately enough, which shows a classic Dutch house, the flat landscape, and fields of flowers, with colors which made many of Monet's critics accuse him of being insane, of using the brightest red he could get out of his tubes, and purples and greens and yellows there. So there's almost a certainty that Van Gogh saw that picture and several more like it. And how could he not have been influenced? How could he not have been excited by that? And it's one of the sort of sub-themes of his time in Paris, there are many, that he wants to try and get his head around Impressionism. How do you deal with color like that? How do you deal with color when you see it in nature? And Seurat has spoken very eloquently about this and in what happens in Provence, where he finally sort of gets up courage to use his strongest colors and to dare to produce pictures like this with purple and yellow and gold and so on in them. There's no evidence that they actually met. He might have seen him pass on the sidewalk. Don't forget, Monet by this time was making money. He was comfortably off. He was a successful artist. People were writing about him in the papers. Van Gogh was a nobody. He dressed in poor clothing. He could speak French, but he didn't have any confidence. He wasn't yet anybody. So even if he had seen Monet, Monet might not have wanted to speak to him. I mean, not that Monet was an especially difficult man, but why should he? So thank you all for coming. And if you haven't been to the exhibition and looked at the catalogue, do it now.